The screech of metal against iron tore through the quiet Colorado dawn at exactly 5:45. My son swung the crowbar again, while his wife screamed my name, convinced their intimidation tactics would work one last time. But as I watched them struggle with the new reinforced gate, my hands were steady. They thought they were breaking in to claim their inheritance, but they were actually locking themselves out of my life forever. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 57 years old, and until this morning, I was just another widow living in a house that had grown too large for one person. But as the sun began to crest over the mountains of our quiet Colorado town, I became something else entirely. I became the enemy. It was exactly 5:45 in the morning when the silence was shattered. The noise was violent and rhythmic, the sound of steel striking reinforced iron. I stood in my hallway, barefoot on the cold hardwood floor, watching the security feed on the tablet in my hands. The camera provided a crisp, black and white view of the chaos at my front boundary. My son, Mason, was swinging a rusted crowbar with a desperation that made him look like a stranger. Beside him stood his wife, Lorraine. She was not swinging a weapon, but her hands were gripping the bars of my new gate, her mouth open in a scream that the double-paned glass of my windows mercifully dampened. They were trying to break in. They assumed the gate was the same decorative iron latch that had been there since Mason was a boy, the one he used to hop over when he came home late from high school parties. They did not know that I had replaced the entire mechanism 2 days ago. They did not know that the decorative exterior now concealed a heavy-duty locking system designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. I should have been terrified. Any mother watching her only child attack her home with a weapon should be reaching for the phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. But my hands were steady. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. But it was not the rhythm of fear. It was the rhythm of resolve. I had spent the last 4 weeks crying, trembling, and mourning the family I thought I had. Those tears were gone now. All that was left was the cold clarity of a woman who had been pushed too far. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was biting, smelling of pine and impending rain. Mason froze mid-swing. The crowbar hung in the air, a heavy accusation. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, sweat making his hair stick to his forehead. For a second, I saw the confusion in his eyes. He expected to see a frail, confused old woman. He expected to see his victim. "Mom?" he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and panic. "Open this gate. The code isn't working. We know you changed it." Lorraine stepped forward, her face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. "Eleanor, stop this madness right now. We live here. You cannot lock us out of our own home. We have rights." I stood still, tightening the belt of my robe. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "You do not live here, Lorraine. Not anymore." "You are confused," Lorraine screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me. "See, Mason. I told you she is having an episode. She doesn't even know who we are." Mason gripped the crowbar tighter, taking a step back as if to swing again. "I am coming in. Mom, don't make me break this down. It is for your own good." "I would not do that if I were you." "Mason." A deep, calm voice resonated from the shadows behind me. Mason and Lorraine jumped as if the ground had electrified them. They had been so focused on their prey that they had not looked into the darkness of the open doorway, from the gloom of the foyer. Henry Wallace stepped out into the porch light. He was a tall man, 70 years of age, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit. He held a leather briefcase in one hand, and he looked at my son with the same disappointed expression he had worn 20 years ago when Mason had been caught shoplifting. Henry. Mason lowered the crowbar, the metal clanging against the pavement as his grip failed. "What are you doing here?" "I am advising my client," Henry said, his voice smooth and unyielding. "And I am witnessing what appears to be attempted burglary and destruction of private property." Lorraine's face went from red to a ghostly pale. She looked from Henry to me, and for the first time, the arrogance in her eyes flickered out, replaced by a dawn of genuine terror. She realized in that split second that I was not alone. She realized that the helpless widow act was over. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. It felt like the heavy, static-charged atmosphere right before a tornado touches down. Mason looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, searching for the mother who had always bailed him out, the mother who had always written the check. "Mum, please," he whispered. But I did not move. I had rehearsed this moment in my head for weeks. I thought it would feel like victory, but it felt like surgery necessary, but painful. To understand why I stood there, cold and unmoving, while my son begged at my gate. You have to understand that this did not happen overnight. You have to understand that I did not lock them out because I hated them. I locked them out because they had already broken in and stolen everything that mattered. You need to know how a mother's love was weaponized against her. It started quietly, with a lie, and it ended here, with a crowbar and a shattered heart. Let me tell you how we got here. The house at 41 Maple Street was always too big for just 2 people, let alone 1. After my husband Patrick passed away 3 years ago, the 4 bedrooms and the sprawling living room became a museum of our 35 years together. Every scratch on the hardwood floor told a story, and every faded photograph on the mantel was a testament to a life built on hard work and simple joys. I stayed because the silence, though heavy, felt like Patrick was still there, sitting in his favorite leather armchair, reading the Sunday paper. I never imagined that the silence would be broken not by the laughter of grandchildren, but by a slow, suffocating invasion. My son, Mason, was the center of my world. Growing up, he was a sensitive boy, the kind who would rescue injured birds and bring them to me in a shoebox. But people change. Or perhaps they just reveal who they really are under pressure. The change in Mason began 5 years ago when he met Lorraine. Lorraine was stunning, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they touched. She was ambitious, a woman who spoke in corporate buzzwords and looked at my antique oak dining table not with appreciation, but with a critique of its resale value. I tried to love her because Mason loved her, and for a mother, that is usually enough. The call that started it all came on a Tuesday evening in late October. Mason sounded frantic, his voice thick with unshed tears. He told me they had lost everything. A business deal had gone south. Their landlord was evicting them, and they had nowhere to go. He spoke of sleeping in their car, of being cold and hungry. My heart broke instantly. I did not hesitate. I told them to come home. I told them that as long as I had a roof over my head, so did they. I believed that is what family does. We circle the wagons when the wolves come. When they arrived the next day, the back of their rented truck was packed with expensive furniture that seemed at odds with their story of financial ruin. But I pushed the thought away. The first 2 weeks were like a balm for my lonely soul. The house smelled of roasting chicken and garlic bread again. We ate dinner together at the table Patrick had built. Mason smiled. Lorraine was polite and helpful, and I felt a purpose returning to my days. I was not just the widow in the big house anymore. I was a mother helping her children get back on their feet. However, the warmth was short-lived. It started with subtle shifts, tiny ripples that I barely noticed until they became waves. It began in the kitchen. I came down one morning to find my spice rack rearranged. The jars were not in alphabetical order, as I had kept them for decades, but grouped by color. When I asked about it, Lorraine laughed, a tinkling sound that did not reach her eyes. She told me she was just trying to help me update my system because my way was inefficient. She said it with such sweetness that I felt guilty for being annoyed. Then, the changes moved to the living room. Patrick's reading glasses, which I kept on the side table as a comfort, disappeared. When I asked, Lorraine said she had put them in a drawer to declutter the space. She said clutter creates anxiety, and she wanted me to feel peaceful. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I told myself she meant well. I told myself that I was just a rigid old woman who was too set in her ways. I made excuses for them because I wanted the peace to last. I did not see then that these were not acts of kindness. They were tests. Lorraine was pushing against my boundaries, seeing how much ground I would cede before I fought back. And because I loved my son, and because I was lonely, I gave her inch after inch. I did not realize that some people do not want to share a home. They want to conquer it. I was asking myself how much a mother should sacrifice for her child, never suspecting that the price they were asking was not just my hospitality, but my entire existence. The invasion of my home did not happen with a bang, but with the quiet scrape of furniture across the floorboards while I was out running errands. I remember coming home one Tuesday afternoon, my arms full of groceries, to find that the living room I had known for 40 years had been completely reconfigured. The heavy oak coffee table, a piece Patrick and I had bought for $600 back in the 80s, was gone. In its place stood a flimsy, sharp-edged glass table that looked like it belonged in a dentist's waiting room. The Persian rug, the one with the intricate red patterns that Patrick loved, was rolled up and shoved into a corner like a discarded wrapper. When I dropped the grocery bags on the counter, the sound made Lorraine jump. She was standing in the middle of the room, hands on her hips, surveying her work with a satisfied smirk. Before I could even ask where my table was, she beat me to it. She told me the room needed to breathe. She said the heavy wood was oppressive and sucked the energy out of the space. When I asked where she had put it, she waved a hand vaguely toward the garage and said she had moved it to storage to create better flow. She spoke to me not as the homeowner, but as a child who didn't understand the complexities of interior design. I went to the garage later that evening. The table was there, but it had been dragged carelessly, leaving a deep scratch along one leg. Beside it was a box of Patrick's things, his bowling trophies, his collection of maps, and the framed photo of his platoon. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stormed back inside and confronted Mason. I expected him to be outraged. I expected him to tell his wife that she had crossed a line. Instead, he barely looked up from his phone. He told me that I was being dramatic. He said that Lorraine was just trying to help organize the house because it was too cluttered for someone my age to manage. He called my treasured memories junk and told me I should be grateful that Lorraine was taking the time to modernize the place. That was the first time I felt like a stranger in my own house. Over the next few weeks, the feeling intensified. I would walk into a room and find that a lamp had been moved, or a painting had been taken down. When I asked about them, Lorraine would look at me with wide, innocent eyes and tell me that we had discussed it already. She would say things like, "Eleanor, we talked about this at breakfast. Don't you remember?" Or, "You agreed that the hallway was too dark with that picture there." I began to doubt my own mind. I would lie awake at night, replaying conversations, trying to find the gaps in my memory. I did not know the term gaslighting then, but I was living in its suffocating grip. The insults were wrapped in concern. Lorraine would make comments about how my taste was quaint or dusty. She started buying ready-made meals, claiming that my cooking was too heavy and unhealthy for Mason's heart, subtly implying that I had been poisoning my family with grease for decades. My vintage tea set, the one with the hand-painted roses, disappeared from the china cabinet. When I demanded to know where it was, Lorraine sighed as if she were dealing with a toddler. She told me she had donated it to a charity shop because chipped china holds bacteria, and she was worried about my health. That tea set was pristine. It was worth over $1,000, but the money didn't matter. It was the erasure of my history that stung. I tried to fight back. I tried to move things back to their places, but Mason would always intervene. He would put a hand on my shoulder, his grip a little too firm, and tell me that I was being difficult. He said that if I wanted them to stay and help me, I needed to be flexible. He twisted the narrative until I was the villain, the stubborn old woman who cared more about dusty objects than her own struggling son. But the final straw, the moment the cold shard of suspicion truly pierced my heart, happened on a Sunday. I walked past the dining room and heard them talking in low voices. They were not talking about job interviews or apartment listings. They were discussing walls. Lorraine was saying that if they knocked down the wall between the kitchen and the dining room, it would add 20% to the value. Mason was nodding, agreeing that an open concept was what buyers wanted these days. I froze in the hallway. Why would they care about the resale value of my house? Why would they care about open concepts if they were only staying for a few months? A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows settled into my bones. They were not renovating for me. They were not settling in temporarily. They were preparing for a future where I was no longer the mistress of this house, and perhaps not even a resident. I retreated to the safety of my bedroom, my heart pounding a rhythm of panic and betrayal against my ribs, only to find that even this sanctuary had been breached. On the nightstand, right beside the lamp I had read by for 20 years, lay a glossy brochure that had not been there when I went downstairs for tea. It was for a company called Clear Path Estate Sales, a service specializing in liquidating assets for seniors transitioning to assisted living. Next to the brochure was a yellow legal pad with Mason's familiar scrawl. My hands shook as I picked it up. He had written down a list of numbers, calculations of square footage, and estimates for quick cosmetic upgrades. At the bottom of the page, circled 3 times in red ink, was the number $750,000. That was the exact market value of my home. They were not just making the house more comfortable for their stay. They were calculating its liquidation value. They were not measuring the walls for paint. They were measuring my expiration date. Standing there in the dim light of my bedroom, the realization washed over me cold and absolute. This was not a family visiting for a season. This was a hostile takeover, and I was the only obstacle standing between them and the fortune they believed was already theirs. The atmosphere in the house shifted from merely uncomfortable to suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm that refuses to break. Lorraine's strategy evolved from subtle displacement to aggressive micromanagement disguised as benevolence. She began to intercept my mail, claiming she wanted to save me the stress of sorting through bills and junk advertisements. She started answering the landline, telling my friends from the book club that I was napping or not feeling up to visitors. When I confronted her, she would tilt her head with practiced concern and ask if I was having one of my bad days again. She planted the seed that I was mentally declining, not just in my mind, but in the minds of everyone who called. Then came the emotional erosion from Mason, my son, who used to look at me with admiration, now looked at me with a mixture of pity and irritation. One evening, over a dinner of rubbery takeout that Lorraine insisted was a gourmet treat, Mason put his fork down and sighed heavily. He told me that watching me try to maintain such a massive property was painful for him. He said I was becoming a liability to myself and that my stubbornness was a danger. The word liability struck me harder than a physical blow. He did not say it with open malice, which made it worse. He said it with a weary resignation that made me feel small, useless, and incredibly burdensome. That conversation was the prelude to their first major tactical move. 2 days later, they sat me down in the living room, flanking me like interrogators. Lorraine placed a sleek folder on the coffee table. They suggested that, strictly for legal convenience and future tax benefits, it would be wise for me to transfer the deed of the house into Mason's name, or at least add him to the title immediately. Lorraine explained that this would protect the asset from the state if I ever needed long-term nursing care. She spoke rapidly, using terms like probate avoidance and asset protection, her eyes gleaming with a predatory intensity. When I hesitated, saying I needed to consult my own lawyer, Mason snapped. He asked if I did not trust my own son. He asked if I wanted to leave them with a legal nightmare when I eventually died. It was a cruel manipulation, leveraging his future inheritance against my present security. I held my ground that night, claiming a headache to escape the conversation. But the dynamic in the house turned dark. I began to catch snippets of their private conversations when they thought I was asleep or working in the garden. Through the thin drywall of the guest room, I heard whispers that chilled my blood. They were not discussing how to care for me. They were discussing the current real estate boom. I heard Mason mention a listing price of $800,000. I heard Lorraine talking about a luxury condo in downtown Denver and how much happier they would be in the city. They were not planning to live with me. They were planning to cash me out. Their control tightened physically as well. One morning, I tried to check my email to contact my old friend Henry, but the password on the Wi-Fi router had been changed. When I asked Lorraine, she said she had updated the security protocols because my old password was too simple and vulnerable to hackers. She promised to write the new one down for me, but never did. A week later, I went to the study to open the wall safe where I kept my emergency cash and jewelry. The keypad was dead. Mason told me the mechanism was jamming, and he had locked it down to prevent it from breaking permanently. He said he would handle the valuables from now on, so I did not have to worry my tired mind about them. My confidence began to erode like a sandcastle in the tide. I started to question my own sanity. Did I really forget to lock the back door? Did I really leave the stove on? They told me I did, and for a dark period, I believed them. But in the depth of that despair, I noticed a crucial detail. I watched Mason closely when Lorraine was not in the room. I saw the hesitation in his hands, the way he could not meet my eyes when he repeated the lies she fed him. I realized that the cruelty was not originating from him. It was being manufactured by Lorraine and injected into him. He was weak. Yes, But he was being weaponized. And if he was a weapon, Lorraine was the hand aiming him. That realization did not break me. It woke me up. The turning point did not come with a shout, but with a whisper I was never meant to hear. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was tending to the roses near the kitchen window, the only solace I had left. Inside, the window was cracked open just an inch. I heard Lorraine's voice, distinct and sharp, drifting through the screen. She was on the phone, but not with her mother or a friend. She was negotiating. She described a vintage silver tea service, mid-century, excellent condition, and haggled over a price of $400. My stomach twisted. That tea service was my grandmother's wedding gift. Lorraine had told me she donated it to the Salvation Army 2 weeks ago because it was tarnished junk, driven by a sudden, icy clarity. I waited until they left for dinner that evening. I walked 2 miles to the public library to use a computer, bypassing the blocked Wi-Fi at home. It took me only 10 minutes to find the listing on a local marketplace site. There it was, photographed on my own dining table, my grandmother's silver, listed under a user profile named Laurie Lukes. I scrolled down and saw my crystal vase, Patrick's old telescope, and even the silk runner from the hallway, all sold or pending. She was not decluttering my home. She was liquidating my life for cash. When I returned home, I went straight to the wall safe in the study. Mason thought he had locked me out, but he had forgotten that Patrick and I installed that safe together in 1995. I knew the mechanical override key was taped behind the baseboard heater. I retrieved it and opened the heavy steel door. The envelope where I kept my emergency cash, $5,000 in $100 bills, was empty. The emptiness of that envelope felt like a physical punch to the gut. I confronted them the moment they walked through the door. I held the empty envelope in my shaking hand and demanded an explanation. Mason looked at the floor, his face flushing a deep crimson, but Lorraine did not even blink. She looked at Mason and said, with terrifying calmness, that I must be having another episode. She turned to me and said I had given them that money for groceries and bills last week, when I screamed that she was lying. Mason stepped between us. He put his hands on my shoulders and told me to calm down, saying that my memory was getting worse and that I was becoming paranoid. He sided with the thief against his own mother, rewriting reality to protect her crimes. 2 days later, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I was downtown for a dentist appointment when I saw Lorraine's car. She was not at the grocery store or looking for jobs. She was walking out of a building with a discreet sign that read, Clearwater Aesthetic Surgery Center. She was wearing dark sunglasses and holding a bandage to her nose. The pieces fell together with a sickening thud. My grandmother's silver, my emergency savings. The rent money they claimed they didn't have it was all funding her rhinoplasty and cosmetic enhancements. She was carving a new face for herself out of my retirement. I stopped crying that day. I went to the stationery store and bought a black notebook. I began to document everything, every item missing, every time they left the house, every conversation I could recall. I called my oldest friend, Sarah, a retired history teacher with a mind like a steel trap. We met at a diner 3 towns over so I would not be seen. Sarah looked at my notes, her lips pressed into a thin line. She helped me organize the chaos into a timeline of theft and elder abuse. She told me that I needed more than notes. I needed a smoking gun. I got that gun on a Thursday night. I had started leaving my bedroom door open a crack, sleeping in my day clothes. Around 2 a.m, I heard them in the kitchen. I crept to the top of the stairs. moving as silently as a ghost in my own home. We cannot wait another 6 months. Lorraine, Mason whispered, his voice sounding strained. She is getting suspicious. Then we accelerate the timeline. Lorraine hissed back. I spoke to the administrator at Shady Pines. They have a bed opening in the dementia ward next week. We get the doctor to sign off on her incompetence. We move her in on Monday, and the power of attorney kicks in fully. Once she is in the facility, we sell the house. She will hate it there, Mason said. But there was no fight in his voice, only a weak resignation. It smells like urine and bleach. She won't know the difference after a few weeks. Lorraine replied coldly. And with the house money, we can finally move to the city. Do you want this house, or do you want a future? Mason. I retreated to my room, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. They were not just stealing my money. They were planning to discard me like the vintage furniture they sold online. They were going to lock me away in a facility to rot so they could cash out my existence. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since Patrick died, I felt a fire ignite in my chest. They wanted a war. I would give them one. I woke up the next morning with a clarity that felt sharp and cold, like a winter wind cutting through fog. For months, I had been drowning in grief and confusion, but the conversation I had overheard the night before had burned all of that away. As I stared at the empty side of the bed, I heard Patrick's voice as clearly as if he were lying next to me. It was the last thing he told me before the cancer took his voice away. He had squeezed my hand and whispered that I should never let anyone make me a victim, not even the people I loved. I realized then that by trying to be a good mother, I had failed his final request. I had let them turn me into prey in my own home. I waited until Mason and Lorraine left for what they claimed was a job interview, but was likely a consultation with a real estate agent. As soon as their car turned the corner, I drove straight to the law offices of Henry Wallace. Henry had been our family attorney for 40 years. He had written our wills, helped us close on the house, and stood by me at Patrick's funeral. When I sat in his leather chair and laid out my black notebook, his professional demeanor cracked. He read the timeline of the missing money, the sold heirlooms, and the plans for the nursing home. When he looked up, his eyes were hard. He told me that this was not just bad behavior. He called it exploitation and conspiracy. Henry moved fast. He proposed a legal maneuver that would pull the rug out from under them completely. We would create an irrevocable trust. He explained that by placing the house and my remaining assets into this trust, I would effectively cease to own them in my name. I would retain the right to live there for the rest of my life. But I could not sell it. And more importantly, no one could force me to sell it. Mason could not inherit it until I was gone. And even then, Henry drafted strict clauses about how the property could be used. It was a fortress of paper that would render their entire scheme useless. But we needed more than just defense. We needed ammunition. I showed Henry the tiny digital voice recorder that my friend Sarah had given me. It was smaller than a matchbox. Henry nodded and told me to use it. He said we needed indisputable proof of their intent to defraud and their conspiracy to commit elder abuse. He warned me that this would be the hardest part. He told me to go home and act. He said I had to be the confused, frail old woman they wanted me to be. I had to make them feel so safe, so confident in their victory, that they would say everything out loud. I went home and placed the recorder on top of the kitchen cabinets, hidden behind a decorative vine where the dust had gathered. It worked perfectly. That evening, while I sat in the living room staring blankly at the television, the recorder captured them in the kitchen. I heard Lorraine laughing. She called me a senile old bat and bragged to Mason that she had already picked out the paint colours for the condo they would buy with my money. I heard Mason agree, saying that it would be a relief to get rid of the house and put me somewhere where I would be looked after. The audio was crisp and sickeningly clear. For the next 3 days, I gave the performance of a lifetime. When Lorraine scolded me for forgetting where I put my glasses, I apologized and cried. When Mason suggested that I looked tired and confused, I agreed with him and said maybe I did need professional help. I saw the looks they exchanged. It was a look of triumph. They thought I was broken. They thought the house was as good as sold. They had no idea that while they were measuring drapes for a penthouse, I was meeting with a locksmith in a coffee shop 3 blocks away. I paid him $300 in cash and scheduled him for 5 in the morning on Monday, exactly 45 minutes before Mason and Lorraine were set to leave for their final meeting with their lawyer. They thought they were closing a deal. I was closing the door. The performance of my life began on a Wednesday evening over a dinner of pot roast that I had cooked myself. I waited until Mason had finished his second helping before I set my fork down and let a long, defeated sigh escape my lips. I looked at my son and told him that he was right. I told him that I was too old to manage a property of this size and that the maintenance was becoming a burden on my health. I saw the tension leave his shoulders instantly. He looked at Lorraine, and for a brief second, I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated greed light up her eyes like a flare in the dark. Lorraine reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her touch feeling like ice against my skin. She told me that this was the best decision I could make, and that they would take care of everything. She said I would love the assisted living facility, describing it as if it were a luxury resort rather than the warehouse for the unwanted that I knew it to be. I nodded and forced a weak smile, playing the part of the submissive, confused old woman to perfection. I told them I was ready to sign the papers. I suggested that we get it over with as soon as possible so I could stop worrying. The hook was set. Lorraine immediately pulled out her phone and called their legal specialist. A man I suspected was less of a lawyer and more of a predator they had found online. They scheduled the meeting for 9 o'clock the following morning, right here at the dining table. I told them that I had also called Henry Wallace to come over at the same time, just to witness the signature for old time's sake. Lorraine hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing, but Mason waved it off. He said Henry was harmless and old-fashioned, and that having him there would just make the transfer look more legitimate. They were so confident in their victory that they did not see the trap closing around their ankles. To ensure the house was empty for what I needed to do next, I made a suggestion. I told them they should go out and celebrate. I said that since they were about to become the owners of the estate, they deserved a night on the town. Lorraine agreed immediately. She wanted to go to a high-end steakhouse in the city and then stay at a hotel near the casino to blow off steam before the big day. They left at 7 in the evening, giddy with the anticipation of their windfall. As I watched their car taillights disappear down the driveway, the mask of the frail widow dropped from my face. 10 minutes later, a white van pulled up to the service entrance. It was not a guest, but the locksmith I had hired from a neighbouring county to ensure he had no connection to anyone Mason might know. For the next 3 hours, the house was filled with the hum of drills and the sharp click of metal tumblers being replaced. We did not just change the front door, we changed everything. The back sliding doors, the garage access, the side entrance, and most importantly, the electronic control box for the main driveway gate. When the locksmith handed me the new master key, it felt heavy and cold in my palm, like the trigger of a loaded gun. I paid him an extra $200 for his silence, locked every bolt, and went to bed. I slept deeply for the first time in months, knowing that the fortress was secure. The sun rose on a crisp morning, illuminating the trap I had laid. At 8:45, exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled signing, Mason's car pulled up to the driveway. I was standing in the foyer, watching the security monitor with a cup of coffee in my hand. They looked like they were dressed for a coronation. Mason was wearing his best navy suit, and Lorraine was in a cream-colored dress that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a month. They were laughing, probably joking about how easy it had been to push the old woman out of the way. I watched Mason roll down his window and reach for the keypad. He punched in the code my birthday that had worked for 20 years. The gate did not move. He frowned, leaned out further, and punched it in again. Harder this time. The red light on the box blinked mockingly. Lorraine said something to him, her face twisting with impatience. Mason got out of the car, adjusting his tie, and pulled out his keyring. He tried to shove his old key into the manual override lock on the gate. It stopped halfway. He pushed, jiggled, and twisted. But the new cylinder was a stranger to his key. The confusion on their faces was delicious. They assumed it was a mechanical failure, a rusty hinge, or a glitch. They did not yet understand that it was a declaration of war. Lorraine got out of the car, her high heels clicking on the asphalt, and started pointing at the house, clearly telling him to call me. I let the phone ring. I stood there in the silence of my home, watching my son rattle the bars of the gate like a prisoner trying to break out, not realizing he was actually trying to break into a world he no longer belonged to. Behind me, in the kitchen, Henry Wallace was already sitting at the table, organizing the documents that would dismantle their lives. I checked my watch. It was 8:55. It was time to open the gate, not to let them in, but to let the truth out. The screech of the crowbar against the iron was the only sound in the neighborhood, a violent, metallic cry that echoed the desperation of the man wielding it. Mason struck the lock again, his face purple with exertion, while Lorraine gripped the bars with her manicured hands, screaming for me to stop playing games and open the gate. I stood safely behind the heavy oak door of the main house, watching them unravel on the monitor. I waited until Mason raised the bar for one final, frantic strike before I pressed the button on the intercom panel. The electric motor hummed, and the heavy iron gates began to swing open slowly. Mason stumbled back, nearly losing his balance, the crowbar hanging loosely in his grip. Lorraine smoothed her dress and fixed her hair, composing herself instantly, assuming that her intimidation had worked. She marched up the driveway with Mason trailing behind her, prepared to scold me like a disobedient child. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, wrapping my cardigan tighter around myself against the morning chill. They stopped at the foot of the stairs. Lorraine opened her mouth to speak, likely to launch into a tirade about the lock, but the words died in her throat. From the shadows of the hallway, Henry Wallace stepped out and stood beside me. He was imposing in his charcoal suit, holding a thick leather binder. He looked at Mason not with anger, but with a profound disappointment that seemed to shrink my son by 2 inches instantly. Mason went pale, the colour draining from his face so fast I thought he might faint. He dropped the crowbar, and it hit the pavement with a dull clang. He knew Henry. He knew that Henry was not just a lawyer. He was the man who had played chess with his father, the man who knew where every skeleton in the family closet was buried. Lorraine tried to recover. She forced a smile that looked more like a grimace and asked what was going on, her eyes darting nervously between Henry and the binder he held. She tried to bluster, saying they had an appointment with their own legal counsel and we were delaying important business. Henry did not even look at her. He opened the binder and adjusted his glasses. He spoke with a voice like gravel, steady and unrelenting. He informed them that there would be no signing today. He explained that, as of 9 o'clock yesterday morning, the property at 41 Maple Street, along with all liquid assets previously held by Eleanor Hayes, had been transferred into the Hayes Family Irrevocable Trust. I watched the realization hit them. Mason shook his head, stammering that it was impossible, that I was not competent to make those decisions. Henry cut him off sharply. He produced a medical certificate signed by 2 independent neurologists, dated 2 days prior, confirming my absolute mental competency. He then explained what the trust meant. He told them that Eleanor Hayes no longer owned this house in her own name. She was merely the beneficiary. She could not sell it. She could not sign it over. And most importantly, upon her passing, the asset would be liquidated with all proceeds going to a charity for homeless veterans, a clause I had added specifically to ensure they would never see a dime. The silence that followed was absolute. Lorraine looked as if she had been slapped. Her dreams of a downtown condo and a nose job fund evaporated in the cool morning air. But Henry was not finished. He turned a page in his binder, and his tone shifted from administrative to prosecutorial. He began to read a list. It was not a list of assets, but a list of crimes. He recited the dates and amounts of cash missing from the safe. He listed the items sold online, matching the photos from Lorraine's account to the inventory of my home. He played a brief audio clip from his phone, the recording of them plotting to put me in a nursing home. He looked at them over the rim of his glasses and said that we had enough evidence to file immediate charges for elder abuse, grand larceny, and conspiracy to defraud. He told them they were looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in state prison if we took this to the district attorney. The unity of the couple shattered instantly. Lorraine let out a high-pitched shriek and pointed a shaking finger at Mason. She screamed that it was all his idea. She claimed she barely knew me and that Mason had told her I wanted to sell the things. She lied with a desperate, frantic energy, trying to distance herself from the man she had been conspiring with 5 minutes ago. Mason looked at his wife with horror. The betrayal sparked something ugly in him. He shouted back, his voice cracking, accusing her of being the mastermind. He yelled that she was the one who found the nursing home, that she was the one who set up the online seller account, and that he had only gone along with it because she threatened to leave him. I stood there on the porch, looking down at the 2 people who had tried to erase me. They were tearing each other apart, vicious and pathetic, exposing the rot at the core of their relationship. I felt no pity. I felt only the immense, heavy relief of the truth finally being spoken. The wolves were not at the door anymore. They were caught in the trap, and they were eating each other. Seeing my son on his knees on the cold concrete of the driveway was a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Mason, who had just moments ago been wielding a crowbar with the intent to destroy, was now crumpled like a discarded piece of paper. He reached out for the hem of my robe, his face wet with tears and sweat. He begged me to understand. He told me that he was drowning in debt and that he had only done it because he was terrified of losing everything. He pleaded for my forgiveness. invoking the memory of the times he had scraped his knees as a boy and I had bandaged them. My heart ached with a physical pain that felt like a heavy stone sitting in my chest. I wanted to reach down, pull him up, and tell him that everything would be all right. That is what a mother does. But I looked at the scratches on my gate and the man standing beside me with a file full of evidence, and I knew that the mother who fixed everything was gone. I looked Mason in the eye and told him that I forgave him because I refused to carry the poison of hatred in my heart for the rest of my days. However, I told him clearly that forgiveness is not the same as amnesia. I could forgive the sinner, but I could no longer trust the son. Lorraine did not kneel. She looked from Mason to Henry, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. She took a step backward toward the car, her hand fumbling for the door handle. She muttered something about leaving and sorting this out later. Henry Wallace stepped forward, his voice booming across the lawn. He warned her that if she left the premises before we concluded this conversation, he would call the sheriff immediately and report her as a flight risk involved in an active fraud investigation. Lorraine froze, her hand dropping from the car door. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the trembling fear of a bully who had finally met someone she could not intimidate. I stepped closer to the edge of the porch and delivered the verdict. I gave them 48 hours. They had exactly 2 days to pack their personal belongings and vacate the premises. I told them that if they were not gone by noon on Saturday, the police would be called to remove them for trespassing, and Henry would file the charges we had prepared. Mason looked up at me, desperation making him play his final, cruelest card. He wiped his nose and asked if I realized that if I did this, I would never see my grandchildren again. He threatened to cut me out of their lives completely. It was a low blow, aimed right at my greatest weakness. For a second, I wavered, but then I felt a sudden warmth, a sense of presence standing right beside me. I remembered Patrick. I remembered his insistence on respect and his disdain for emotional blackmail. I squared my shoulders and looked down at my son. I told him that he could try to keep the children away, but he should know that the trust Henry set up had a specific clause. I explained that the house and the bulk of my estate would bypass him and Lorraine entirely. I told him that the assets were held in trust for my grandchildren, to be released to them only when they turned 25 years old, provided they had maintained a relationship with their grandmother. I watched the colour drain from Lorraine's face as she realised that her children were now worth more to her if they visited me than if they stayed away. I had not just protected my assets, I had secured my access to my grandbabies. Lorraine let out a sound of pure frustration, a sharp cry of defeat. She glared at Mason, cursed him for his incompetence, and stormed past him into the house to start packing. She did not look back. Mason stayed on the ground for a moment longer, looking at the closed door of the house he thought was his, then slowly pulled himself up. He looked at me one last time, searching for the woman who used to be a doormat, but she was not there. He turned and followed his wife, a defeated man walking into a storm he had helped create. I waited until the front door clicked shut behind them. Then, I turned to the control panel on the wall. I pressed the button to close the main gate. The heavy iron wings began to move, groaning slightly before locking together with a solid, final thud. That sound was better than any symphony. It was the sound of a chapter ending. I stood there in the morning silence, the cool air filling my lungs. I was alone. Yes. But for the first time in months, I did not feel lonely. I felt impenetrable. I felt strong. The next 48 hours were a blur of cardboard boxes and icy silence. Mason and Lorraine moved through the house like ghosts, stripping the guest room of their belongings and packing the few items they had actually purchased. There was a moment on the final morning when Mason tried to corner me in the kitchen. He started to speak, his voice trembling, trying to reframe the conversation about the nursing home as a misunderstanding. He claimed they were just exploring options for the distant future. I simply pointed to the clock on the wall. I did not need to say a word. Henry Wallace was sitting in the living room, reading a newspaper. His presence, a silent reminder of the prison sentences hanging over their heads if they pushed me 1 inch further. When they finally walked out the front door, they carried more than just suitcases. They carried the heavy weight of defeat. There were no hugs, no promises to visit soon, and no feigned affection. They got into their car, refusing to make eye contact, and drove away. As their taillights disappeared around the bend, the house exhaled. The tension that had gripped the walls for months evaporated, leaving behind a profound quietness. For the first time in a long time, the silence did not feel lonely. It felt like freedom. I spent the next few weeks repairing the damage. I hired a painter to cover the scuffs on the walls where they had carelessly dragged their furniture. I bought a new rug for the living room, one that I liked, without worrying if it was modern enough for a real estate listing. But the most important repair work was on myself. I started waking up early again to watch the sunrise, drinking my coffee on the porch without fear of judgment or manipulation. I realized that I had allowed my fear of being alone to blind me to the danger of being used. Then came the surprise that healed the last crack in my heart. One evening, the phone rang. It was my eldest granddaughter, Lily. She was crying. She told me that she had known her parents were up to something shady, but she had been too afraid to speak up. She apologized for her silence. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I told her that the sins of the parents are not the sins of the children. We talked for 2 hours. I made it clear that while her parents were not welcome, she and her siblings would always have a home here. I had secured their future in the trust, and now I was securing our relationship. I did not stop there. I joined a local community gardening club and started volunteering at the library on weekends. I met other women, some widows like me, others just looking for connection. I realized that my life was not over just because my husband was gone and my son had betrayed me. In fact, I discovered a new kind of strength. The strength of an older woman is not physical. It is the resilience of having survived the storms. I had walked through the fire of betrayal and come out the other side with my dignity and my home intact. On a clear Tuesday morning, I walked down the driveway to check the mail. I stopped at the gate, the place where the crowbar had struck, the place where my son had tried to break me. The iron was repainted now, smooth and strong. I ran my hand over the cold metal and looked out at the street. I realized that boundaries are not just about locks and keys. They are about self-respect. I closed the gate, listening to the solid click of the mechanism. I whispered to myself that not everyone who calls themselves family is allowed to walk through that door. I turned back toward my house, my sanctuary, and walked up the path to begin the next chapter of a life that was fully, finally, my own. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary. Hit that like button. And if you want to support us even more, Please press the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.